He mocked his ex-wife, dying of cancer, by forcing her to sing at his wedding. But her song left him speechless.
I've waited for this moment all my life.
You ever notice how the richest people are usually the ones with the cheapest souls? Take Elias. This guy spent $40,000 on a cake just to have something to smash his new bride's face into, while his ex-wife, Sarah, was sitting in a waiting room 3 miles away, wondering if she could afford the next round of treatment. But Elias didn't just want her gone, he wanted her to watch him win. He sent a legal notice, not a card, a summons, demanding she honor a performance clause from their divorce. He wanted her to sing at his wedding. And Sarah, she showed up. But the song she picked, let's just say, it wasn't on the wedding playlist. Before we get into how Sarah planned her final move in that chapel, I want to welcome you. We're going deep into this one today because some stories need time to breathe, and the truth about what happened at that altar is something you need to hear in full. If you're the kind of person who believes that money shouldn't be able to buy silence, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories alive. And hey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always good to see who's tuning in. Anyway, let's dive in. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Not a thick one, not a padded one, just a standard business envelope, the kind that carries utility bills and jury summonses. Sarah pulled it from the mailbox between 2 pieces of junk mail, a coupon flyer for a tire shop and a credit card offer addressed to someone named Current Resident. She almost threw it away. The return address was a law firm in downtown Hartford, Greeley, Brandt and Associates. She knew the name. She'd seen it on letterhead before, back when her marriage was still breathing. She didn't open it in the hallway. She carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, next to a pill organizer and a glass of water with a single straw in it, and stood there for about 30 seconds, looking at the envelope. The way you look at something you already know is going to cost you something you can't afford. Then she opened it. The letter was 2 pages. The language was dense, compressed into paragraphs that sounded like they'd been written by someone who charged by the word. But the meaning was simple enough. Elias Hargrove, her ex-husband, and the man she'd spent 11 years married to and another 8 months divorced from, was getting married again. June 14th, St. Avery's Chapel on the Hudson, and pursuant to Section 7, subsection C of their divorce agreement, a clause labeled Mutual Celebratory Participation. Sarah was legally required to perform a song at the ceremony. She read that paragraph 3 times. The clause had been buried in the divorce papers. 47 pages of legal language negotiated over the course of 6 months by attorneys who billed $400 an hour. Sarah had signed everything. She'd been exhausted. The cancer diagnosis had come 4 months before the divorce was finalized, and by that point, she was already spending most of her energy just getting through the days. Her own lawyer, a woman named Diane, who worked out of a strip mall office and charged a fraction of what Elias's people did, had flagged the clause as unusual. Diane had said, "This is strange. Do you want me to push back on it?" Sarah had said, "Just get it done. I need this over." She got it done. She got it over. And now, here was the receipt. Sarah set the letter down and pressed her fingertips against the edge of the counter. The kitchen was quiet. Mid-morning light came through the window above the sink, hitting the linoleum in a way that made the scratches visible. She'd moved into this apartment 8 months ago, a 1-bedroom on Elm Street, above a dry cleaner. The rent was $640 a month. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the woman upstairs watching television at night, the laugh track bleeding through like a ghost. She picked up the letter again, read the last paragraph. The deadline for confirmation was May 28th, 14 days away. Then she picked up her phone and called Diane. Diane listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished reading the relevant sections aloud, there was a pause on the other end. The kind of pause that means someone is choosing their words carefully. "He can enforce this," Diane said. "It's in the agreement. You signed it." "I know I signed it." "Do you want me to file a motion to have it voided? On the grounds of—" "On what grounds?" Another pause. "Hardship. Your medical situation. I could argue that the clause was signed under duress, that you weren't in a position to—" "Diane." Sarah's voice was flat, not angry, just tired, the way a road gets tired after too many winters. "Yeah, how much would that cost?" The silence that followed was its own answer. "Okay," Sarah said, "so I have to do it." "You have to do it." Sarah thanked her, hung up, stood in the kitchen for a while longer, turning the letter over in her hands, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She laughed. It was a short laugh, dry and sudden, and it hurt somewhere in her chest, not emotionally, but physically, the way a cough does when your ribs are already sore. But it was real. It came from somewhere genuine, because here was what Elias didn't know. Here was what none of them knew. Sarah could sing. Not the way people say someone can sing, meaning they're passable, they won't embarrass you at karaoke. Sarah could actually sing. She'd studied vocal performance at the conservatory in Boston before she dropped out to marry Elias, and back when she was 22 and he was 35, and the age gap felt exciting rather than strategic. Her voice was a mezzo-soprano with a low, smoky quality that sounded like something you'd hear in a dimly lit room at 2 in the morning. The kind of voice that made people stop talking. Elias knew this. He'd heard her sing dozens of times during their marriage, hundreds of times. Once, at a charity gala in Greenwich, a music director had approached them afterward and asked if Sarah had ever considered a professional career. Elias had smiled and said, "She's retired." Sarah had been standing right there when he said it, so Elias knew exactly what weapon he was handing her. He just didn't think she'd know how to use it. Elias Hargrove had built his life the way some people build a wall, one brick at a time, and each one placed with precision, each one load-bearing. He was 53 now, though his face looked 48 because he could afford the kind of skincare that normal people couldn't pronounce. He wore suits that cost more than most people's first cars, but he never drew attention to this fact. That was the trick. The real money never announced itself. It just sat there, quiet and immovable, like gravity. He lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, 42 floors up. The view from the living room window was Manhattan spread out like a circuit board, all light and geometry, no mess visible from that height. The apartment had been featured in a magazine 2 years ago. Elias had agreed to the interview on one condition: no photographs of the bedroom. The journalist had noted this in her article as evidence of his private nature. It was, but not for the reasons she assumed. The penthouse had a kitchen with Italian marble countertops and a refrigerator that cost $11,000 and was mostly empty. Elias ate out. He ate at restaurants where the menu didn't have prices on it, where the sommelier remembered his preferred wine without being told. He ate well. He ate expensively. But he ate alone, most nights, at a corner table with a book or a phone, and the waiters knew not to linger. His new bride's name was Juliet Castellan. She was 31. She was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful when money has had access to them since childhood. Maintained, polished, photographed well. She came from old Connecticut money. Her father owned a shipping company and a vineyard in Provence, and a quiet, persistent reputation for being cruel to people who worked for him. Juliet herself was not cruel exactly. She was simply indifferent to cruelty when it happened around her, the way some people are indifferent to weather. She and Elias had been dating for 14 months when he proposed. The ring was 3 carats, oval cut, set in platinum. He'd bought it at a jeweler on Fifth Avenue, where the cases were locked and the salesman wore ties. Juliet had accepted it in a restaurant in the Hamptons, and the other diners had applauded. And Elias had smiled the smile of a man who understood that public rituals mattered. The wedding was planned by a firm in Manhattan that specialized in events so expensive they stopped being celebrations and became productions. The guest list was 342 people. The venue, St. Avery's Chapel, was a Gothic revival church that had been built in 1887 and renovated in 2019 with funding from a hedge fund manager who wanted his name on the stained glass. The flowers alone cost $9,000. The photographer had a waiting list 18 months long. Elias had chosen every detail: the caterer, the string quartet, the specific shade of ivory for the tablecloths. He had chosen the wine, the appetizers, the order of the toasts. He had chosen also to send a legal summons to his ex-wife 3 weeks before the ceremony, demanding she sing at his wedding. This was not spontaneous. This was planned. Elias had always been a planner. It was the trait that had made him successful, if successful was the right word for what he had become. Nay, he saw the future in a way that most people didn't. Not as something that happened to you, but as something you built, one decision at a time, each one placed precisely, each one designed to produce a specific outcome. He'd been doing this since his 20s, when he'd started in finance at a mid-tier firm in Boston and spent his first 3 years studying not just the markets, but the people in them, learning who wanted what, learning how to position himself at the intersection of other people's desires, learning that the fastest way to accumulate wealth was not to produce anything valuable, but to move money from one place to another and take a percentage of the movement. He was good at it, frighteningly good. By his mid-30s, he was running his own fund, and by his early 40s, he had more money than he could spend in 2 lifetimes. The money itself didn't interest him. Not really, not the way it interested some people. What interested him was the architecture of it, the systems, the way money moved through the world like blood through veins, invisible and essential, and the way you could redirect that flow if you understood the anatomy well enough. The offshore accounts were not an accident. They were the logical extension of everything Elias had always done, a refinement of the system, a way to move money beyond the reach of the tax authorities and the regulators and the occasional journalist who might start asking questions. He hadn't thought of it as criminal exactly. He'd thought of it as optimization. The rules were there, but the rules had gaps, and the gaps were there to be found, and finding them was not a crime. It was a skill. The crime, if there was one, and was in the exploitation of the gaps. And Elias had always believed, with a quiet, unexamined certainty, that exploitation was simply what people with his capabilities did. This belief, this foundational conviction, that the world operated according to a hierarchy of capability and that he sat near the top of it, was the thing that made the performance clause make sense. Elias did not think of Sarah as an equal. He had never thought of her as an equal. She was, in his mental architecture, a figure of a specific type: attractive, agreeable, useful for a period of time, and then disposable when the usefulness ended. The marriage had been a phase, the divorce had been a transition, and the performance clause was the final punctuation, a way of reinforcing, even after the marriage was over, that Elias was the one who set the terms. That Juliet found out about the clause on a Wednesday evening. They were in the penthouse, sitting on opposite ends of a leather sofa that cost more than Sarah's yearly rent. Elias was on the phone with his event coordinator, going over the final timeline for the ceremony. Juliet was flipping through a magazine, half listening. "What performance clause?" she asked when he hung up. Elias set his phone down, picked up a glass of bourbon. Blanton's, $40 a pour at the bar, but he kept a bottle at home. Took a sip. Explained. Juliet listened. Her expression didn't change much. She'd learned, over years of wealthy Connecticut dinners, how to keep her face neutral while processing information that would have made other people flinch. "So your ex-wife has to sing at our wedding," she said. "She's contractually obligated to." "Why did you put that in the divorce papers?" Elias smiled. It was the smile of someone who enjoys being asked questions he already has answers to. "Insurance," he said. "Insurance against what?" He took another sip of bourbon. "Against her ever feeling like she got away with something." Juliet looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at her magazine. She didn't ask any more questions. This was one of the things Elias liked about her. She understood that some men needed to leave their marks on the world, and she didn't try to talk them out of it. What Juliet did not know, and what Elias had not told her, was that the performance clause had been put into the divorce papers not as insurance, but as punishment. A slow, a delayed punishment, a bootstrap trap buried in the paperwork that would go off years later when Elias found someone new. He'd planned it even before the divorce was final. He'd planned it while Sarah was still in the house, still cooking dinner, still trying to save the marriage. He'd planted it in the legal language the way you plant a mine in a field. And then he'd waited. The waiting was the point. Elias liked waiting. He liked knowing that something was coming for someone else, and they didn't know it yet. It was for him a form of control, the purest form, because it operated invisibly in the future, beyond anyone's ability to stop. 3 miles from the penthouse, in a different borough and a different tax bracket, Sarah sat in a plastic chair in the oncology wing of a hospital on a Thursday afternoon. The chair was the kind of institutional beige that suggested nobody had chosen it. It had simply appeared, the way furniture does, in places where comfort was never the priority. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of recycled air. A television mounted in the corner played a morning show on mute, the hosts moving their mouths in silence, while captions scrolled underneath, advertising mattress sales and weather forecasts for cities Sarah had never visited. An older man across the room was filling out a form with a pen attached to the clipboard by a chain, the way banks used to do. A woman in her 40s sat 2 chairs away, scrolling through her phone with one hand and holding a paper cup of coffee in the other, and in every few minutes she looked up at the door to the treatment rooms with an expression that was trying very hard to be calm. Sarah had been coming here for 7 months. Every other Thursday, she sat in this chair, waited her turn, walked through that door, and spent 4 hours attached to an IV while a chemical dripped into her bloodstream that killed cells indiscriminately the cancerous ones, and a fair number of the healthy ones alongside them. The chemo was cisplatin-based. Her oncologist, a quiet man named Dr. Rhodes, who wore the same brand of corduroys every week, had explained the protocol in his office with a diagram on a whiteboard, using words like cytotoxic and peripheral neuropathy and response rate. Sarah had nodded through all of it. She understood enough. The cancer was in her lungs, on stage 3B when it was found, which meant it had already spread beyond the original site but hadn't yet reached her bones or her brain. Dr. Rhodes had used the word aggressive in their first meeting, and Sarah had filed that word away in the part of her mind where she kept things she didn't want to look at directly. Aggressive meant fast. Fast meant the window was narrow. The chemo was buying time. But time, in this context, was measured in months, not years. She was 38 years old. Sarah had told almost no one about the diagnosis. Her mother knew. Her mother lived in Vermont, in a small house near a lake, and when Sarah called to tell her, her mother had gone very quiet on the phone for about a minute, and then she'd said, "Okay, what do you need?" Which was exactly the right thing to say. A few friends knew. Diane, or her lawyer, knew because the medical bills had become relevant to the divorce proceedings. Sarah had cited them as part of the financial hardship argument, though in the end it hadn't mattered because the argument itself had cost too much to pursue. The bills were staggering, not just the treatment itself, the cisplatin, the anti-nausea medication, the blood work done every 2 weeks to check her cell counts, but the peripheral costs that nobody warned you about. The taxi fares to and from the hospital because she couldn't drive on chemo days, her hands too unsteady and her reaction time too slow. The over-the-counter medications, the ones that weren't covered by insurance, that lined up on the bathroom shelf like soldiers, each one addressing a different side effect. The nutritional supplements, the compression socks for the peripheral neuropathy that was beginning to creep into her fingers and toes, a tingling numbness that Dr. Rhodes called expected and that Sarah called one more thing. The cost of living while sick was not a single line item. It was 100 small ones, each individually manageable, collectively crushing, like sand filling a room, grain by grain, until one day you looked around and realized the floor was gone. She kept a spreadsheet on her laptop, updated it every Sunday night, sitting at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and a glass of water, and the pill organizer in front of her like a small plastic calendar of survival. The numbers told a story she didn't want to read but couldn't look away from. Savings going down, expenses staying flat. The gap between the two widening every month, unlike a crack in ice. Elias did not know. Or rather, Elias knew. He'd been told, through his lawyers, that Sarah had been diagnosed with cancer, but he didn't know the severity of it. He didn't know it was stage 3. He didn't know about the chemo, the 4-hour sessions, the metallic taste that settled on her tongue every Thursday afternoon and stayed for days, a taste like pennies and rust, like biting the inside of your cheek, like the memory of something unpleasant that your body refused to forget. He didn't know about the way her hair had started to thin, strand by strand at first, then in handfuls, until one morning in March, she'd stood in the bathroom pulling at what was left and realized there wasn't enough to cover. He didn't know about the wig, bought from a shop in Midtown that specialized in medical-grade hairpieces, and cost $400, fitted by a woman who did this work every day and who had, with a gentleness that Sarah didn't expect and didn't know how to respond to, adjusted the cap to fit the shape of Sarah's thinning head. Sarah had made a deliberate choice not to broadcast her illness. Not out of pride exactly, though there was some pride in it, more out of a recognition that sympathy from certain people was just another form of control. If Elias knew how sick she was, he would use it, not cruelly necessarily. Elias was not cruel in the way a child is cruel, with open malice and visible enjoyment. He was cruel the way weather is cruel, impersonal, structural, operating according to its own logic. So she kept it quiet, wore the wig, went to her appointments, nurse came home to the apartment above the dry cleaner and sat in the kitchen with her pill organizer and her glass of water and her one-bedroom silence. And then the envelope arrived. Section 7, subsection C of the Hargrove divorce agreement read as follows. In the event that either party enters into a subsequent marital union, the non-entering party shall, upon request and with reasonable notice, participate in one celebratory performance of a musical selection of their choosing at the ceremony, subject to the logistical constraints of the venue and the mutual agreement of the parties regarding scheduling. It was, on its surface, a strange clause. Divorce agreements are strange documents in general. They try to anticipate every possible future interaction between two people who have decided they can no longer live together. Oh, and in doing so, they end up reading like legislation written by someone who has never met a human being. Pre-nuptial agreements specify who gets the dog. Divorce papers specify who pays for the dog's veterinarian. Nobody bats an eye. But this clause was different. This clause was specific in a way that suggested it had been crafted for a particular purpose, not a general one. And the purpose was this. Elias wanted Sarah to stand in front of his new wife, in front of his guests, in front of the world he had built since their marriage ended, and perform. Not testify, not speak, perform. The word was deliberate. It reduced Sarah to a function, an entertainment, an act, something to be consumed by an audience that Elias controlled. Diane had flagged it during the divorce negotiations. She'd called it unusual and potentially coercive. Sarah had not pushed back. She'd been 4 months into her diagnosis, already losing weight, already spending afternoons in bed, staring at the ceiling while the fatigue pressed down on her like a physical weight. She wanted the divorce done. She wanted Elias out of her life. She signed. Now, 8 months later, standing in her kitchen with the summons in her hand, Sarah understood what the clause actually was. It was a time bomb. A small, precise, legally binding time bomb that Elias had planted in the wreckage of their marriage, and it had just gone off. She could have fought it. Diane had given her the option, a motion to void the clause on medical grounds, an argument that enforcing it would constitute undue hardship given Sarah's health situation. The motion might have worked. It might also have cost $3,000 in legal fees, which Sarah did not have, and it might have required Sarah to disclose the full extent of her illness in court filings, which she did not want to do. So instead of fighting it, Sarah did something else. She sat down at her kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, a cheap ballpoint, the kind that comes in a box of 12 from the drugstore, and she began to write. What most people don't understand about financial crimes is how boring they are. The movies make it look glamorous. Boardrooms full of men in expensive suits, screens full of numbers scrolling past, dramatic confrontations across mahogany tables. The reality is spreadsheets. The reality is offshore accounts with names that sound like vacation destinations. The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, but are really just mailing addresses for shell companies that exist on paper and nowhere else. The reality is, Wire transfers scheduled at 3 in the morning, routed through 4 different jurisdictions, each one adding another layer of legal complexity that takes a trained forensic accountant months to untangle. Elias had been doing this for 12 years. Sarah knew because she'd lived inside it, not as a participant. She'd never touched the money, never signed the forms, never understood, during the marriage, exactly what was happening with the accounts. But she'd been present. She'd been in the room when the phone calls happened. She'd seen the documents on his desk, the ones he didn't bother to hide because he didn't think she was paying attention. She'd heard the conversations. Late at night, now after he thought she was asleep, his voice low and even, speaking to someone overseas about restructuring and moving the position and the Zurich entity. There was a pattern to it. Elias was meticulous. He kept records, not written ones, not on paper, but mental ones. He carried the numbers in his head, the way a chess player carries the positions of pieces on a board, and sometimes, when he was relaxed, after bourbon, after a successful dinner, in the particular looseness that settles over a man when he believes no one important is listening. He would talk, not to Sarah directly, to the room, almost, to himself. A running monologue of satisfaction, the way some men narrate their own victories to an empty audience. Sarah had been that audience. For 11 years, she had been the woman in the next room, the woman half asleep on the sofa, with the woman whose presence was so thoroughly discounted that Elias forgot she was there. And she had listened, not because she wanted to, not because she understood, at the time, what she was hearing. She listened because she was the kind of person who absorbed information the way a sponge absorbs water, passively, completely, without effort. The details settled into her memory like photographs developing in a dark room. The first offshore account was opened in 2011. She remembered this because it was the year they moved into the penthouse, the year Elias had stood in the empty living room with the Manhattan skyline behind him and said, "This is what we built." She remembered the name of the shell company, Meridian Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands with no employees and no physical address. She remembered the name because she'd asked about it once, casually, over dinner, and Elias had smiled and said, "Just a holding structure, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." And she had stopped worrying about it because that was what you did when your husband told you not to worry. You stopped and you moved on and you forgot that you'd ever asked. But she hadn't forgotten. Not really. The name stayed in her, the way names do when they're attached to something that felt, even at the time, slightly wrong. Meridian Holdings, the Cayman Islands, 2011. These were seeds, planted without intention, that germinated slowly over the years that followed. And there were more. The Nassau lawyer, Gerald Poole, a thin man with a careful manner, whom Elias had met at a conference in Nassau and invited to dinner afterward and at a restaurant overlooking the harbor. Sarah had been there. She'd sat across from Poole and made conversation. Small talk, the kind that fills space at business dinners, and she'd noticed the way Poole's eyes moved when Elias spoke, the particular attentiveness of someone who was being offered something valuable. She'd noticed, and she'd filed it away, and she'd thought nothing more of it until years later when the pieces began to connect. The wire transfers were the hardest to remember precisely. But Sarah's memory for numbers was sharper than she'd ever told anyone, a gift from childhood, from her father, who had been an accountant and who used to quiz her on figures as a game during car rides. "What's 743 times 12? He'd ask, and Sarah would multiply it in her head, and he'd check the answer, and then sometimes he was wrong. And she was right. And the look on his face when that happened was one of the few memories from her childhood that carried no weight of sadness. She remembered the amounts, not all of them, but enough. Enough to trace the movement of money from Elias's legitimate accounts to the offshore entities. Enough to establish a pattern. Enough to give a forensic accountant a starting point from which the full picture could be assembled. And she remembered all of it. During the divorce, Sarah's lawyer had not asked about Elias's finances in any serious way. The settlement had been generous. Elias had given Sarah a substantial sum, enough to cover her medical costs and live modestly for a few years. In exchange, Sarah had agreed to a non-disclosure clause. She could not publicly discuss the details of their marriage, their finances, or any business dealings she had witnessed during their time together. The non-disclosure clause had a time limit. It expired on June 1st. The wedding was June 14th. Sarah had noticed this coincidence when she first read the divorce papers. She'd filed it away, another detail lodged in the sediment, and she had not thought about it again until the envelope from Greeley, Brandt and Associates arrived on that Tuesday in May. Now she thought about it. Now she sat at her kitchen table with a notepad and a pen and began to write down everything she remembered. Account numbers, dates of transfers, names of shell companies, the name of the man in Zurich that Elias spoke to on the phone, a man named Werner Scholl, who ran a private bank that did not ask questions about where money came from, the name of the lawyer in Nassau who set up the offshore entities, the approximate amounts, and Sarah's memory for amounts was precise because she'd spent 11 years watching Elias manage money the way other men manage collections of rare objects with a quiet obsessiveness that bordered on devotion. She filled 6 pages of the notepad. Then she closed it, set the pen down, and sat very still for a long time, listening to the woman upstairs change channels. The wedding coordinator called Sarah on May 30th. A woman named Bridget, with a voice that was professionally warm, the kind of warmth that comes from years of managing other people's happiness and learning to sound invested in it. Bridget wanted to schedule a rehearsal. She wanted to know what Sarah planned to sing, and she wanted to know if Sarah had any technical requirements, a microphone, sheet music on a stand, anything like that. Sarah told her she didn't need sheet music. She told her she'd be singing an original piece. She told her she had no technical requirements beyond a microphone. Bridget paused. An original piece, she said. Mr. Hargrove mentioned that you might be singing something classical, something in keeping with the tone of the ceremony. It will be original, Sarah said. It will be in keeping with the tone. Another pause. Bridget, to her credit, did not push. She confirmed the time. Sarah would sing after the vows before the first toast, and ended the call. Sarah hung up and looked out the kitchen window. The view was the back wall of the building next door, a flat expanse of brick with a single rusted fire escape running up it. A pigeon was sitting on the railing of the escape, pecking at something. The afternoon light hit the brick in a way that made it look almost warm. She had 9 days. The work happened mostly at night. Sarah's body operated on a rhythm that the chemo had disrupted and never fully restored. She slept in the afternoons, woke up around midnight, and spent the dark hours in a state of strange clarity, as though the chemicals had burned away everything unnecessary and left only the essential functions running. During these hours, she wrote, the apartment was very quiet at night. The dry cleaner below was closed, had been since 6 in the evening, and the woman upstairs went to bed early, and in the street outside was the particular kind of silent that New York streets get after 2 in the morning. Not truly silent, because there was always the distant hum of the city, the occasional siren, the thrum of traffic on the avenue 2 blocks over. But quiet enough that Sarah could hear the scratch of her pen on the notepad. Quiet enough that the words she was writing seemed to exist, not just on the page, but in the air around her, filling the kitchen the way smoke fills a room. The song, though song is perhaps too simple a word for what she was constructing, was built on a structure she'd learned in the conservatory 20 years ago. It was called a through-composed piece, a vocal work that doesn't repeat, doesn't circle back, doesn't offer the listener the comfort of a familiar chorus. Each section moves forward, and building on what came before, arriving somewhere that could not have been predicted from the beginning. Sarah's composition teacher at the conservatory, a Hungarian woman named Dr. Varga, who smoked cigarettes during lessons and spoke about music as though it were a living thing, something with its own metabolism, had called it the architecture of inevitability. You didn't hear where it was going until it was already there. Sarah wrote the melody first. It came to her on the second night, not gradually, not piece by piece, but whole, as though it had been waiting somewhere and she had simply opened a door and let it in. It was simple, almost deceptively so. A descending line, minor key, the kind of melody that could be mistaken for a lullaby if you weren't listening to the words. The melody was beautiful. And Sarah was a good enough composer to know this without vanity. She had spent 4 years studying this craft, had developed the ability to evaluate her own work with the same detachment a carpenter uses when running a hand along a joint. The melody was well made, more than well made. It was the kind of beauty that disarms, that makes you lean in, that makes you stop what you're doing and listen, because the sound itself is doing something to you before the meaning catches up. She hummed it that night, very quietly, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. The melody moved through the apartment like a thread, winding through the silence, and Sarah followed it with her voice, soft, barely above a whisper, until she reached the end, and the last note faded, and the kitchen was quiet again. Then she picked up the pen and began to write the words. The words came next, and the words were not beautiful. The words were precise. They were specific. They were dates and numbers and names, arranged in a sequence that sounded on the surface like a love song, or rather, like a eulogy for a love song, a mourning piece for something that had died. But underneath the surface, beneath the melody and the emotional register, the words carried information. Elias's offshore accounts, the shell companies in the Caymans and Nassau, the wire transfers, specific amounts, specific dates, specific routing codes, the name of Werner Scholl, the name of the Nassau lawyer, the structure of the fraud, laid out in a sequence that any forensic accountant could follow, dressed up in the language of grief and loss and the slow end of a marriage. Sarah wrote for 9 nights. She revised obsessively, not the melody, arches which came to her whole, but the words which had to serve 2 masters simultaneously. They had to sound like lyrics. They had to sound like something a woman would sing at the wedding of the man who had destroyed her. And they had to contain, woven into that emotional fabric, enough legally actionable information to end Elias's career, his freedom, and possibly his life as he knew it. On the night of June 12th, 2 days before the wedding, Sarah finished the piece. She sat at the kitchen table and read through it one final time, from beginning to end, and when she reached the last line, she set the notepad down and pressed both hands flat against the table and breathed. Then she called her mother in Vermont. "Mum," she said, "I need you to come to New York." St. Avery's Chapel seated 342 people, and every seat was filled. Elias had spent months curating the guest list with the same care he applied to everything else in his life. Deliberately, strategically, with an eye toward the social architecture of the room. The front pews held family: Juliet's parents, her two sisters, Elias's brother Gerald, who lived in Arizona and ran a landscaping company and had the vague, permanent sunburn of someone who spent too much time outdoors. Behind them, the next few rows held the inner circle: business associates, close friends, the kind of people who got invited to the penthouse for bourbon and stayed until midnight talking about real estate and tax strategy. Further back, the room opened up into the broader social ecosystem that Elias inhabited. Investors, board members, the wives and husbands of investors and board members, and a handful of journalists who covered the financial world and had been invited not as press, but as guests, which meant they were expected to behave like guests and not write about what they saw. A few of them would anyway. That was understood. What was not understood, what nobody in the room knew, was that Sarah had made one phone call 2 weeks before the wedding that had changed the composition of the guest list in ways that Elias could not have anticipated. The call was to a woman named Patricia Garrett. Patricia worked for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She was not glamorous. She wore sensible shoes and drove a Honda Civic and had been investigating white-collar fraud for 19 years. She was also, as it happened, already looking into Elias Hargrove. Not because of anything Sarah had told her. Sarah had never spoken to Patricia before that phone call. But because one of Elias's business partners, a man named Douglas Rowe, had been cooperating with federal investigators for the past 8 months, and the information he'd provided had pointed repeatedly toward Elias. The investigation was sealed. Elias didn't know about it. His lawyers didn't know about it. The only people who knew were Patricia and her team and a federal judge in the Southern District of New York named Judge Arthur Whitfield, who had been reviewing the case files for months and had, 3 weeks before the wedding, issued a sealed subpoena for Elias's financial records. Sarah called Patricia on June 1st, the day the non-disclosure clause expired. She told Patricia everything she remembered: the account numbers, and the dates, the shell companies, Werner Scholl, the Nassau lawyer. She told Patricia about the performance clause in the divorce agreement, about the fact that Elias had legally compelled her to sing at his wedding in front of hundreds of people, and that she intended to do so. Patricia listened. She did not interrupt. When Sarah finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Not the silence of someone choosing words, but the silence of someone recalculating. "You're going to sing this at the wedding," Patricia said. It was not a question. "Yes." "In front of everyone?" "Yes." Another pause. "Ms. Hargrove, it's just Sarah." "Sarah, I need to be transparent with you about something. This information you're giving me, if it's accurate, I have reason to believe it's going to be extremely difficult for Elias Hargrove to contain once it's public, even if he has lawyers present, even if he tries to shut it down in the moment. Once it's spoken aloud, in a room full of witnesses, it's in the record." "I know," Sarah said. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah looked out the kitchen window. The pigeon was back on the fire escape. The brick wall was the same shade of grey it always was. The woman upstairs was watching television again. Sarah could hear the faint murmur of it through the ceiling. "I'm sure," she said. Patricia made arrangements. She couldn't invite herself to the wedding. That would have tipped off Elias's security team, which was thorough if not particularly sophisticated. But she could ensure that certain people were in the room. The federal agents in plain clothes, positioned in the back rows, blending into the crowd of investors and socialites with the practiced ease of people who did this for a living. She could also ensure that Judge Whitfield was informed, not of the specific content of what Sarah planned to sing, but of the possibility that legally significant information might become public at the ceremony. Whitfield, for his part, had quietly added 2 names to the chapel's guest list through intermediaries, names that appeared on the invitation list as business contacts of Juliet's father, but were, in fact, federal prosecutors attached to the case. The guest list was now 344. June 14th arrived the way June mornings do in the Hudson Valley. Bright, slightly humid, with a sky so blue it looked artificial. Sarah woke at 6, and earlier than usual. The fatigue was there, as it always was, a weight that sat in her bones like wet sand. But underneath it, something else. Something that felt, if not like energy, then like its close cousin. Resolve, maybe, or something sharper than resolve. She showered. The water ran over her skin, thinner than it used to be, the bones of her shoulders more visible than they'd been a year ago, and she stood under it for longer than necessary, letting the heat work on the stiffness in her chest. The wig was on the bathroom counter, hanging on a small wooden stand. She'd bought a second one, newer, for the wedding, also from the Midtown shop, also medical grade, but this one was a slightly warmer brown, closer to her natural color before the chemo took it. Her mother was asleep on the sofa in the living room. Ruth had arrived 2 days earlier, driving down from Vermont in her 10-year-old Subaru, bringing a casserole and an overnight bag, and the quiet, undemanding presence that Sarah remembered from childhood. The kind of presence that didn't ask questions unless you wanted to answer them, that simply existed nearby, solid and warm, like a fire in another room. Sarah made coffee. Ruth woke up around 7, emerged from the living room with her hair uncombed and her reading glasses on top of her head, and sat at the kitchen table without speaking. They drank coffee together in silence for a while. The morning light came through the window. Somewhere below them, the dry cleaner was opening up. Sarah could smell the faint chemical tang of it, rising through the floorboards. "How do you feel?" Ruth asked eventually. "Tired," Sarah said. But okay." Ruth nodded. She knew what okay meant, coming from Sarah. It meant the same thing it always meant. Not great, but functional, capable, able to do what needed to be done. "Do you want me to come?" Ruth asked. Sarah had thought about this. Having her mother in the chapel would be a comfort, but it would also be a distraction. And Sarah needed to be focused. She needed every part of her attention on the performance. The melody, the words, the delivery. She couldn't afford to look into the audience and see her mother's face and feel anything other than what she needed to feel. "No," she said. "Stay here. I'll call you after." Ruth accepted this without argument. She reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. A brief, firm pressure. And then she let go and went back to her coffee. And they sat together in the quiet kitchen while the morning got brighter outside. Sarah dressed carefully. The dress was not new. She couldn't afford new, not really, not with the medical bills eating through her savings like acid through cloth. It was a dress she'd had since before the divorce, a navy blue wrap dress that she'd bought at a department store on a sale rack 3 years ago. It was simple. It fit well. It was the kind of dress that disappears into the background, that doesn't ask for attention, which was exactly what Sarah wanted. She didn't want people looking at her clothes. She wanted them listening to her voice. She put on the wig, looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back was thin, thinner than she'd like, but composed. The wig was good. The dress was good. The face in the mirror was calm, which was either genuine or a very convincing performance, and Sarah wasn't entirely sure which. She put on a small amount of makeup. Lipstick, a deep burgundy, the only color she owned, and mascara. Nothing else. She looked at herself one more time. Then she picked up her purse, which contained the notepad with the finished lyrics, a bottle of water, and a single aspirin for the headache that had been building since she woke up, and she walked out the door. St. Avery's Chapel sat on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, surrounded by old oaks that had been there since before the Civil War. The building itself was stone, grey granite, darkened by a century of weather, with a copper roof that had gone green with age. The front doors were oak, banded with iron, and they were propped open when Sarah arrived, letting in the warm June air and the sound of the string quartet warming up inside. She parked in a lot behind the chapel, a paved area that had been landscaped with gravel and low hedges to look less like a parking lot and more like something intentional. A valet was directing cars. Sarah drove past him. Her car was a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and a bumper sticker from a radio station she no longer listened to, and parked in the far corner where the gravel gave way to grass and the shadows of the oaks made it darker. She sat in the car for a moment after turning off the engine. The chapel was visible through the windshield, framed by the trees, and through the open doors she could see the interior. The rows of white chairs, the altar at the far end, the flowers cascading from every available surface, in arrangements so elaborate they looked almost aggressive. The lilies were everywhere, white and cream and a pale yellow that might have been called ivory by someone who sold flowers for a living. The room was filling up. Sarah watched through the windshield as guests arrived. Women in dresses that cost more than her rent. Men in suits that fit like they'd been sewn directly onto their bodies. A photographer moved through the crowd with a camera that probably cost $5,000, snapping candid shots that would look effortless in the final album. A woman in a headset, Bridget presumably, moved through the room checking things, adjusting things, the way a stage manager does before a performance. Sarah got out of the car, closed the door quietly, stood in the gravel for a moment, feeling the sun on her face, and the weight of the wig on her head, and the low, persistent ache in her chest that was not emotional but physical. The cancer, doing its slow work beneath her ribs. Then she walked toward the chapel. The interior of the chapel was cooler than outside. Stone walls held the temperature steady, and the air conditioning system, installed during the 2019 renovation, hummed almost imperceptibly, a sound so low it felt less like a noise and more like a vibration in the floor. The lilies filled the air with a sweetness that was almost cloying, the kind of smell that starts pleasant, and after 20 minutes becomes something you stop noticing, or something you start associating with the specific event rather than the flower itself. Sarah entered through a side door that Bridget had indicated in an email. The door led to a small antechamber, a stone room with a wooden bench and a full-length mirror and a single window that looked out onto the gardens. This was where the wedding party waited before the ceremony. Right now, it was empty, except for a bouquet of roses on the bench, and a glass of champagne that someone had left half-finished on the windowsill. Sarah sat down on the bench. She set her purse on her lap and opened it and took out the notepad. The lyrics were on 6 pages, written in her small, precise handwriting. She read through them one more time, slowly, her lips moving slightly as she followed the words. The melody played in her head as she read. She'd been carrying it for days now, a constant companion, the way a song gets stuck in your head, but in reverse. She'd written it, and now it wouldn't leave. She closed the notepad and put it back in her purse. She didn't need it. She had memorized every word, every note, every breath mark. The piece was in her body now, stored in the same place where muscle memory lives, not in the conscious mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere that operates without thinking. Through the wall, she could hear the chapel filling up, the murmur of conversation, the scrape of chairs, the occasional burst of laughter that was too loud for the space. Someone had already had champagne. The string quartet was playing something soft and classical, background music, the kind of thing you don't listen to so much as absorb. Sarah closed her eyes, breathed. The fatigue was there. It was always there, but it was distant now, pushed back by something else, something that felt almost like adrenaline, but wasn't quite. It was focus, pure, clean focus, the kind that narrows the world down to a single point. She thought about Elias, not with anger. Anger required energy she didn't have to spare. She thought about him with something closer to clarity. She understood him, in this moment, the way you understand a mechanism once you've seen all its parts. He was a man who needed control, who needed to be the one with the power, the one with the leverage, the one who knew the outcome before anyone else did. The performance clause was the ultimate expression of that need, a way to reduce Sarah, to make her small, to force her into a role that served his narrative of dominance. He had no idea what he'd actually done. He had given her a stage. At 2 o'clock, precisely, the string quartet shifted from background music to the processional. The guests settled into their chairs. The murmur of conversation dropped to a whisper, and then to silence. Elias stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, tailored so precisely that it looked like it had been painted on. His tie was a deep burgundy silk, the same color, though he didn't know this, as Sarah's lipstick. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, and his posture was perfect, and his face wore the expression of a man who is experiencing a moment he has rehearsed many times and is now performing for an audience. Juliet walked down the aisle on her father's arm. She wore a dress of white silk crepe that moved around her like water, and her hair was pulled back in a way that showed the line of her jaw. And she was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, not just in the way that money makes people beautiful, but in a way that was hers, and that existed independent of the dress and the flowers and the 6-figure wedding. Elias watched her come toward him, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that might have been real, something that looked briefly like the man he could have been if he hadn't spent 30 years building himself into the man he was. The officiant, a minister named Reverend Thomas, who had a gentle voice and a way of speaking that suggested he believed in what he was saying, began the ceremony. The vows were traditional. "Do you take this woman?" The words filled the chapel, echoing slightly off the stone walls, and the guests listened with the attentive quiet of people who understood that this was a performance and were prepared to appreciate it. Elias said, "I do." Juliet said, "I do." Rings were exchanged. platinum bands, simple, elegant. The efficient pronounced them married. There was applause, polite, warm, the kind of applause that fills a room without overwhelming it. And then Reverend Thomas looked out at the congregation and said, "Before we move to the reception, we have a special musical performance. Please welcome to the microphone Ms. Sarah Hargrove." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the specific charged quality of 344 people turning their heads in unison to look at a woman they had not expected to see. Sarah stood up from a chair in the third row, a chair she had been sitting in quietly for the past 40 minutes, invisible in her navy dress and her wig and her burgundy lipstick, another face in a crowd of faces. She had arrived early. She had found her seat. She had sat down and folded her hands in her lap and watched the ceremony with an expression that gave nothing away. Not the exhaustion, not the illness, not the fury or the grief or the strange, quiet satisfaction that had been building in her chest since she walked into the chapel. She stood up now, picked up her purse, out of habit, or maybe out of necessity, though she didn't need the notepad, set it down again, smoothed the front of her dress, took a breath. The walk to the microphone took about 15 seconds. It felt longer. The chapel was very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight, that you can feel pressing against your skin. The guests watched her walk. Some of them knew who she was, others didn't. They just saw a thin woman in a blue dress and moving toward the altar with a deliberateness that suggested she knew exactly where she was going. Elias watched her from the altar. His expression did not change. He had expected this. He had engineered it. But something in the way Sarah moved, something in the set of her shoulders and the steadiness of her gait, made him shift his weight slightly. A small adjustment, barely visible, but there. Sarah reached the microphone. It was on a stand, positioned slightly to the left of the altar, angled toward the congregation. She adjusted the height. It was set for someone taller than her, and then she stood there, one hand resting lightly on the stand, and looked out at the room. 344 faces looked back. The chapel was magnificent in the way that rooms full of expensive things can be. Not beautiful exactly, but impressive. The stone walls rose to vaulted ceilings 40 feet overhead, where the light from the stained glass windows fell in colored panels across the white chairs and the ivory tablecloths and the faces of the guests. The lilies filled every surface, and their scent was so thick in the air that breathing it felt almost solid, like swallowing something. The string quartet sat in the corner with their instruments resting in their laps, watching Sarah with the particular stillness of musicians who recognize, when they see it, someone who knows what a voice can do. The afternoon sun came through the east window and hit the altar in a single shaft of light, the kind that photographers spend hours trying to recreate and that physics simply hands out for free on certain afternoons in June. Sarah looked at all of it, the beauty, the expense. The 344 people in their careful clothes, their understated jewelry, their shoes that had been handmade in countries where craftsmanship still existed as an art rather than a marketing term. These were people who had never sat in a plastic chair in an oncology waiting room and done arithmetic in their heads about whether they could afford to keep living. These were people who had never worn a wig because the alternative was too frightening to face in the mirror. These were people who had never received an envelope on a Tuesday and understood, before opening it, that it was going to cost them something they couldn't pay. She looked at them, and she felt the distance between them, between this room and the kitchen above the dry cleaner, 3 miles away. And the distance was real, and it was vast, and it did not matter. Not today. Today, the distance collapsed. Today, the woman in the blue dress, with the wig and the burgundy lipstick, stood at a microphone in a room full of wealth and power and privilege, and she was about to do the one thing that none of them could stop. She found her mother's face. No, her mother wasn't here. She found Patricia's face. No, Patricia wasn't here either, not visibly. She found, instead, the faces of strangers, investors, socialites, a few journalists who were pretending not to take notes. In the back row, 2 men in suits who looked slightly too attentive to be wedding guests and who were, in fact, federal prosecutors. She found Juliet's face, curious, a little uncertain, the way you look when something unexpected happens at an event you've spent months planning. She found Elias's face. He was watching her. His jaw was set. His hands were clasped. His eyes were calm. The calm of a man who believes he is in control of the situation. Sarah held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned slightly, adjusted the microphone, and began to sing. The first note came out of silence, the way a single crack comes out of ice. Quiet at first, then spreading. It was a D flat, below middle C. The lowest comfortable note in Sarah's range, the one that lived in her chest rather than her throat, the one that vibrated in her bones when she sang it. She held it for 3 beats, letting it fill the chapel, letting it settle into the stone and the wood and the silence of the room. Then the melody began. It moved downward, a slow descending line, each note a half step lower than the last, the way water moves down a hill. The melody was sad. Not the kind of sad that makes you cry, the kind that makes you go still. The kind that sounds like something ending, slowly, with no drama, just the quiet fact of it. The guests leaned forward in their chairs, without realizing they were doing it. The string quartet, which had been set to play an accompaniment, did not play. Sarah had told Bridget she didn't need accompaniment. The silence around the melody made it larger, made it fill more space, made every note feel like it was the only sound in the world. The first verse was a love song, or rather, it sounded like a love song. The words were arranged in the patterns and rhythms of one, with the emotional cadences that audiences recognize instinctively. Lines about remembering, lines about loss, lines about the distance between 2 people who once shared a bed and now shared nothing but a legal document. The melody underneath these words was gorgeous, genuinely, uncomplicatedly gorgeous. And for the first 30 seconds, that was all the room heard. Beauty, grief, a woman singing about the end of something. Then the words changed. It happened so subtly that most people in the room didn't notice the shift at first. The emotional register stayed the same. Still sad, still quiet, still moving in the patterns of mourning. But the content began to change. The abstract language of grief gave way to specifics, names, numbers, dates, account references that sounded on the surface like poetic imagery. The house on the 7th Street of the island where no one speaks your name, but were, to anyone listening carefully, precise coordinates. To the Cayman Islands, Shell Company number 7. The account registered under a fictitious name. Sarah's voice did not change as the words shifted. It stayed in the same register, the same emotional key. The melody continued its descending line. To the casual listener, to someone who was hearing the beauty of the voice and the sadness of the song, and not paying attention to the specific content of the words, it sounded like a woman pouring out her grief, like a eulogy set to music, like the last thing someone says before they stop saying anything at all. But to the people in the back row, the federal prosecutors, it sounded like a confession, someone else's confession, delivered in real time, with the precision of a witness statement and the unmistakable authority of someone who had been there. Elias heard it. Not all of it. Not at first. The first verse had lulled him into the same complacency it had lulled everyone else into. He was watching Sarah with the expression of a man who is enjoying watching someone perform a task he has assigned. A slight smile, a subtle satisfaction. The performance clause enforced, his ex-wife singing at his wedding. It was working exactly as he had planned. Then the second verse began, and the words changed, and Elias's smile disappeared. It disappeared quickly, a fraction of a second, a flicker of something crossing his face that he immediately suppressed. But Juliet, standing beside him, saw it. She saw the color leave his face, just slightly, a thinning of the blood beneath his skin. She saw his hands, which had been clasped in front of him, separate and fall to his sides, and then clench into fists at his back. He didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Not without drawing attention to himself, not without making a scene in front of 342 guests and 2 federal prosecutors and a handful of journalists who were already watching him with the particular alertness of people who sense that something is happening that they will want to write about later. So he stood there, and he listened. The third verse was where the song stopped being a love song entirely. The melody shifted, not dramatically, not with a sudden change in key or tempo, but with a gradual darkening, the way light changes in the late afternoon when the sun moves behind a cloud. The notes descended further, into a range that felt less like singing and more like speaking, a low, steady cadence that carried the words with a clarity that made them impossible to mishear. And Sarah sang about Werner Scholl. She didn't use his name directly. The melody wouldn't have supported it, and besides, the precision of the information she was conveying made the name almost unnecessary. She sang about the man in the white city who keeps the books that no one reads. And then she sang the account numbers, 12 digits, spoken in a rhythm that fit the meter of the melody like they'd been written for it, because they had been. She sang the dates of the wire transfers, 7 of them, spanning 4 years, each one corresponding to a specific movement of funds from Elias's U.S. accounts to the offshore entities. She sang the amounts. The room was absolutely silent. Not the silence of people listening to music, the silence of people who have realized, collectively and simultaneously, that something unprecedented is happening. The silence of 344 people holding their breath. Sarah's voice filled it, clear, precise, devastating. The melody carried the information the way a river carries sediment, smoothly, inevitably, without effort. Each note placed exactly where it needed to be, each word landing with the weight of evidence. In the back row, one of the federal prosecutors, a woman named Catherine Dunn, who had been with the Southern District for 11 years and had seen a great many things in courtrooms, leaned forward and whispered something to her colleague. He nodded once. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. The information was being delivered to the room, and the room was full of witnesses, and witnesses, once they have heard something, cannot unhear it. Elias stood at the altar and did not move. His face was blank, the blankness of someone whose internal landscape has just been demolished and who has not yet figured out what the rubble looks like. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was tight. Juliet, beside him, had turned slightly away from him. Not deliberately, not as a statement, but instinctively, the way an animal turns away from something that has suddenly become dangerous. The last verse was short. 40 seconds of music, maybe less. Sarah sang it quietly, the quietest she had sung all morning, the melody barely above a whisper, each note placed with such care that it sounded less like a performance and more like a confession of her own. The words were simple. No account numbers here, no dates, no names, just the plain, an unadorned truth of what had happened between two people who had once loved each other and had ended up here, in this chapel, with this distance between them. She sang about watching someone you love become someone you don't recognize. She sang about the moment you realized that the person you married was never really there, that what you loved was a performance, and the man behind the performance was someone you would never have chosen, given the choice. She sang about sitting in a waiting room with a letter in your hand and understanding finally that you had been used. Not loved, used. The melody descended one final time. A single note, held, sustained, vibrating in the stone walls of the chapel. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah stood at the microphone for a moment longer. Her hand was still resting on the stand. Her eyes were closed. The fatigue was back. It had been there the whole time, underneath everything. But now it rose to the surface like something that had been waiting for permission. Her chest hurt. Her bones ached. The wig was warm on her head, and the dress was slightly too loose around her waist, and she was 38 years old and dying, and she had just done the thing she came here to do. She opened her eyes, looked out at the room one more time. 344 faces, all of them still, all of them staring. She found Elias's eyes. He was looking at her, really looking, for the first time in years, with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has just seen something he cannot unsee, who has just understood something he cannot unknow. Sarah held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she stepped back from the microphone, turned, and walked back toward her seat. She did not sit down. She walked past it, past the third row, past the second row, past the first, and she walked down the side aisle toward the back of the chapel, moving slowly but steadily, her navy dress brushing against the backs of chairs as she passed, and nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word. The room stayed silent as she walked through it, 344 pairs of eyes following her toward the door. She reached the back of the chapel, paused, turned, one last time, as to look at the altar, at the flowers and the candles, and the man in the charcoal suit, and the woman in the white dress, and the minister with his gentle voice, and the whole elaborate architecture of a day that was supposed to be about celebration. Then she pushed open the side door and stepped out into the June sunlight. The first 20 minutes after Sarah left were chaos, but the quiet kind of chaos, the kind that happens when everyone in a room is trying to figure out what to do, and no one wants to be the first to move. Elias tried to recover. He turned to Juliet and said something. The guests closest to the altar reported later that he said, "That was completely," but he didn't finish the sentence, because at that moment, Catherine Dunn stood up from the back row and said clearly and calmly, "Mr. Hargrove, I'm Catherine Dunn, a federal prosecutor, Southern District of New York. I'm going to need you to stay where you are." Elias looked at her. Then he looked at the man standing beside her. Also a prosecutor, also in a suit that was slightly too plain for a wedding guest. And something in his expression shifted. The recognition again. The understanding. "I'd like to call my lawyer," he said. "You can do that," Dunn said. "But I'd suggest you do it quietly." The guests began to leave. Not all at once. Some stayed, frozen in their chairs, watching the scene unfold with the helpless fascination of people who have stumbled into something they didn't sign up for. Others stood up quickly, grabbed their things, and moved toward the exits with the practiced efficiency of people who have learned in the world of high-net-worth social events how to disappear when the situation calls for it. Juliet did not leave. She stayed standing at the altar, her hands at her sides, her white dress catching the light from the stained glass windows. She looked at Elias, at the man she had agreed 2 hours earlier to spend the rest of her life with, and her expression was very calm. Not the calm of someone in shock, the calm of someone who is assembling information, piece by piece, and beginning to understand the shape of the thing she has just married into. She said something to Elias. The guests who were still in the room couldn't hear what it was. Elias did not respond. The arrest happened 3 days later. Not at the chapel, at the penthouse, on a Monday morning, when 2 federal agents knocked on the door at 7 a.m., and Elias opened it in a bathrobe with a cup of coffee in his hand. The charges were wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The indictment was 47 pages long. Werner Scholl in Zurich was picked up the same day by Swiss authorities acting on a mutual legal assistance request. The Nassau lawyer, a man named Gerald Poole, who had set up 14 shell companies for Elias over the course of a decade, turned himself in before noon. The case moved quickly after that. Elias's lawyers, the same firm that had drafted the divorce papers, the same firm that had buried the performance clause in Section 7, withdrew from the case within a week. Conflict of interest, they said. The truth was simpler. They didn't want to be anywhere near it. Elias hired new lawyers, expensive ones, the kind who specialize in white-collar defense and charge rates that would make most people's eyes water. They filed motions. They challenged the evidence. They argued that Sarah's testimony, delivered not in a courtroom but in a chapel, not under oath but in song, was inadmissible, that it had been obtained through deception, that it constituted some form of entrapment. The motions failed. The evidence was public. It had been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses, recorded on the chapel's audio system. An addition that Bridget, the wedding coordinator, had arranged as part of the ceremony preservation package and reported by 3 journalists who had been in the room and who had, despite their status as guests rather than press, written about what they heard within 48 hours. The trial lasted 11 days. As Sarah did not testify. She did not need to. The audio recording of the performance was admitted into evidence, and the prosecutors played it in full, in the courtroom, while Elias sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his face arranged in an expression of controlled neutrality. Elias was convicted on all counts, sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. The appeal is pending as of this writing, but legal analysts have described the case as airtight. The evidence too specific, too corroborated, too publicly documented to challenge successfully. Sarah did not watch the trial. She followed it in the news, brief updates on her phone, a few articles bookmarked but not read in full. But she did not sit in the courtroom. She did not need to be there for the verdict to mean what it meant. On the day the guilty verdict was announced, Sarah was at the hospital. Thursday, her regular appointment. She sat in the plastic chair in the waiting room, wearing the wig and a cardigan her mother had sent from Vermont, and she read the news on her phone, while the television mounted in the corner played the morning show on mute. Dr. Rhodes came out and called her name. She stood up, put her phone in her pocket, and walked through the door into the treatment room. The IV was set up the same way it always was, the bag hanging from the pole, the tubing coiled neatly, the nurse ready with the needle and the antiseptic wipe, and the small, practiced smile that meant, "I know this isn't fun, but let's get through it." Sarah sat down in the reclining chair, extended her arm. Let the nurse find the vein. It was harder now, and the veins thinner and more fragile after months of puncture, and felt the needle slide in, the cool rush of saline, and then the slow, chemical drip of the cisplatin beginning its work. She closed her eyes. The room was quiet. The hum of the machines, the occasional beep of a monitor, the distant sound of the hospital going about its business. The fatigue settled over her like a blanket, heavy and warm, and she let it. She thought about the chapel, about the moment she had stepped back from the microphone and turned to look at the altar, about the way the room had felt. 344 people, silent, holding their breath, listening to a woman sing the truth. She thought about Elias's face when he finally understood what she had done. That look, not anger, not contempt, but recognition. The look of a man who had spent his entire life believing that money was the only thing that mattered, and who had just watched a woman with no money, no power, no legal leverage, and no time left destroy him with nothing but her voice. She thought about the performance clause, Section 7, subsection C, the trap he had set, the stage he had built for her, without knowing what she would do with it. And she thought, with a quiet, private satisfaction that she shared with no one, not her mother, not Diane, not Patricia, that Elias had given her exactly what she needed. He had given her an audience. He had given her a microphone. He had given her a room full of witnesses and a legal obligation to stand up and sing. He had given her permission to speak, and she had spoken. The story broke on a Saturday. By Monday, it was everywhere. Was a journalist named Catherine Wells, who wrote for a financial news outlet and had been one of the 3 reporters present at the chapel, published the first account. It was measured, careful, the kind of reporting that sticks to facts and lets the facts do the work. She described the ceremony. She described the performance clause. She described Sarah's song. Not the melody, which she could not reproduce in print, but the content, the account numbers, the dates, the names, all of it laid out in the article with the same precision with which Sarah had delivered it. The article went viral within hours, not because of the financial crimes. White-collar fraud stories rarely generate the kind of public attention that, say, a celebrity scandal does. It went viral because of Sarah, because of the image of a woman, sick, broke, illegally compelled to perform at her ex-husband's wedding, who had turned the performance into something else entirely. The comments were immediate and overwhelming. People who had never heard of Elias Hargrove or wire fraud or offshore shell companies suddenly cared, suddenly needed to know what happened next. Social media was full of people sharing the article, adding their own reactions, outrage at Elias, admiration for Sarah, a general sense of collective satisfaction at watching someone powerful get brought down by someone powerless. Sarah saw some of it. Not all. She didn't spend much time online, and the fatigue made extended screen time difficult. But she saw enough. She saw the headline. She saw the comments. She saw, on one platform, a clip of the chapel's audio recording. Someone had uploaded it without authorization, and it had been played hundreds of thousands of times before the chapel's lawyers sent a cease and desist. She listened to the clip once, sat in her kitchen with her phone held close to her ear, listening to her own voice fill the small room, the melody descending, the words precise, the silence of the chapel around her. It sounded different from how it had felt. Singing it, it sounded larger. It sounded like something that belonged to more people than just her. She listened to the end, the final note, the silence after it, and then she set the phone down and looked out the window at the brick wall and the fire escape and the pigeon, which was back again, pecking at something on the railing. Ruth called that evening. They talked for an hour about the news coverage, about the trial, about practical things. Sarah's next appointment, on the apartment lease, the small logistics of a life that was continuing for now, despite everything. Near the end of the call, Ruth said, "Are you okay?" Sarah considered the question. It was not a simple question, and Ruth knew this, knew that okay could mean a dozen different things, depending on the day and the context and the specific texture of the exhaustion that Sarah carried with her everywhere. "I'm okay," Sarah said. And for once, it was true in the fullest sense. Not just functional, not just capable of getting through the day. Actually, okay. The weight in her chest. Not the physical weight. The other one. The one that had been there since the divorce, since the diagnosis, since the envelope arrived on that Tuesday in May, was lighter. Not gone, but lighter. "Good," Ruth said. And they talked about other things, and in the evening passed, and Sarah went to bed early and slept without dreaming. Juliet filed for divorce on June 19th, 5 days after the wedding. The papers were drawn up by a lawyer in Greenwich, not Greeley, Brandt and Associates, obviously, but a quieter firm, one that specialized in the kind of discreet dissolution that wealthy women needed when their marriages ended in federal indictments. The grounds were fraud, not the financial kind, but the personal kind. Juliet's lawyers argued that Elias had concealed the nature of his business activities from her, that she had entered the marriage without knowledge of his criminal conduct, and that the marriage was therefore voidable. The divorce was finalized in August. Juliet kept the apartment. Elias couldn't exactly contest it from a holding cell, and moved back to Connecticut and to her family's house in the Hamptons, where the hedges were tall and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and nobody asked questions about where you'd been or what had happened to you. She did not speak publicly about Elias. She did not give interviews. She did not post on social media about the wedding or the performance or the arrest. She simply disappeared from the story, the way wealthy women sometimes do when the story becomes too loud. Quietly, completely, leaving no trace. But Sarah heard, through Diane, who heard through a mutual acquaintance, that Juliet had done one thing before she left New York. She had sent Sarah a card, not a commercial card, a blank white card, handwritten in a neat, slanted script. It said, "Thank you for what you did. I didn't know. I'm sorry, I didn't know." Sarah read the card at her kitchen table, and read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with it for a while, thinking about what it meant, about Juliet, and about the ways in which people can be complicit in things without knowing they are complicit, and about the difference between ignorance and indifference, and about how sometimes the people who are hurt the most by someone's crimes are the people closest to them, the ones who trusted them the most. She wrote back. A single line on a postcard she bought at the drugstore. You didn't do anything wrong. She mailed it to the address Diane had given her. The Connecticut house, the one with the tall hedges. She didn't know if Juliet received it. She didn't follow up. 3 weeks after the trial, a woman named Dr. Adele Kramer contacted Sarah. Dr. Kramer was a musicologist at Yale. She studied vocal performance, composition, and in the intersection of music with social and political movements. She had listened to the chapel recording, the unauthorized version that had circulated online before the lawyers shut it down, and she wanted to talk to Sarah about the piece. They met at a coffee shop in New Haven. Sarah took the train, an hour and 15 minutes on Metro North, sitting in a window seat with the wig and the cardigan and a thermos of tea her mother had sent. Dr. Kramer was a small woman, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she spent most of her time thinking about things that most people never thought about at all. They talked for 2 hours. Dr. Kramer asked Sarah about the composition process, how she had structured the piece, how she had woven the factual information into the melodic and lyrical framework. And Sarah explained the through-composed structure, the descending melodic line, the way the emotional register stayed constant while the content shifted beneath it. Dr. Kramer listened carefully. Then she said something that Sarah had not expected. What you did, she said, is one of the oldest things music has ever been used for, carrying information in a form that can't be stopped. Before writing, before printing, before radio, music was how people passed truths from one place to another. Songs were containers. They held facts, histories, warnings, and they traveled. Someone would sing them, and someone else would hear them, and the information would move. Sarah nodded. She had known this in a general way, had learned it in the conservatory, in a class on the history of vocal music. But hearing it now, in this context, gave it a weight it hadn't had before. You didn't just expose him, Dr. Kramer said. You used the oldest technology available to you. The one thing that money can't buy, or silence, your voice. Sarah thought about this for a long time after the meeting. On the train back to New York, watching the Connecticut countryside give way to Westchester and then the Bronx, the landscape flattening and darkening as the city approached. She thought about what Dr. Kramer had said about voices and containers and the way information travels. She thought about Elias, sitting in a federal holding cell somewhere, and about the performance clause, and about the $40,000 cake, and the $9,000 flowers, and the penthouse 42 floors up with the empty refrigerator. And she thought, none of that mattered, and none of it had ever mattered. The money, the power, the legal machinery, all of it was paper. All of it was weight that could be moved if you knew where to push. Sarah had known where to push, and she had pushed. The autumn came. The trees along the Hudson turned gold, and then red, and then brown, and the air cooled, and Sarah's appointments continued every other Thursday, the same plastic chair, the same IV, the same slow chemical drip. Dr. Rhodes adjusted the protocol in September. The response had been mixed. The tumor had shrunk slightly, but not enough to call it a remission. They added a second drug. The side effects intensified. Sarah spent more time in bed, more time sleeping, more time in the particular fog that chemo creates, a state that is not quite pain and not quite sleep, but something in between, a gray country where time moves differently. Ruth came down from Vermont more often, sometimes for a weekend, sometimes for longer. She slept on the sofa, made casseroles, sat with Sarah in the kitchen on the afternoons when Sarah felt well enough to sit up, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with illness, or courts, or music, about the lake in Vermont, about Ruth's garden, about a book they were both reading, about the woman upstairs and her television, and the laugh track that bled through the ceiling at night. Sarah did not talk about what was coming. Neither did Ruth. They both knew. The numbers were what they were. Dr. Rhodes had given them, quietly, in his office, in the corduroys he wore every week. The window was narrowing. The treatment was buying time, but the amount of time it was buying was getting smaller. And Sarah accepted this the way she had accepted most things in her life. Not with drama, not with resistance, but with a quiet, clear-eyed acknowledgement that some things cannot be changed, only endured. She had endured Elias. She had endured the divorce. She had endured the diagnosis, and the chemo, and the waiting rooms, and the pill organizers, and the wig, and the frayed edges of her only nice dress. She had endured all of it, and she had done more than endure. She had acted. She had found the one thing that Elias could not take from her, the one thing that no amount of money or legal leverage could silence, and she had used it, her voice. On a Tuesday in late October, a grey day, the sky low and flat, the kind of day when the light seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a notepad. The same notepad she'd used to write the song. Most of the pages were filled now, the lyrics on 6 of them, other notes on the rest. She flipped to a blank page and began to write. Not lyrics this time, not a song. Just words on a page, plain and unadorned. The kind of writing that doesn't perform, doesn't persuade, doesn't carry a hidden message. Just the truth of what had happened, told simply from beginning to end. The marriage, the divorce, the diagnosis, the envelope, the clause, the chapel, the song. She wrote for 3 hours, filled 12 pages. When she finished, she set the pen down and read through what she had written, slowly, the way you read something you've just finished making, checking it, testing it, seeing if it holds. It held. She tore the pages out of the notepad carefully, one by one, and stacked them neatly on the table. Then she called Ruth. "Mom," she said, "I wrote something down. Will you read it?" "Of course," Ruth said. "I'll mail it to you tomorrow." She hung up, looked at the pages on the table. 12 sheets of paper, covered in her small, precise handwriting. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window, hitting the linoleum, making the scratches visible. The dry cleaner's smell rose through the floorboards. Somewhere above her, the woman upstairs turned on the television. Sarah picked up the pages, one by one, and put them in an envelope. She addressed it to Ruth. She stamped it. She set it by the door, where she would pick it up on her way out tomorrow morning. Then she made another cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the brick wall and the fire escape and the grey October sky. And she was quiet for a long time. That was the day Elias learned that some voices can't be silenced, no matter how much money you throw at them. If you found Sarah's journey as powerful as we did, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others find our stories. Don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts on the ending. Did he get what he deserved? We'll see you in the next one.